In this episode, I interviewed Steve McCausland, who served for 32 years as the spokesman for the Maine Department of Public Safety and who has now joined my team at Marshall Communications, handling crisis communications. Steve and I are planning to do media training and media planning with companies, nonprofits, and government organizations to help them prepare for crises that may arise and for handling press conferences and media interviews and staying calm, cool, and collected under pressure. Steve McCausland has so much experience over many, many years in working with the media in crisis situations that I asked him recently to join my team in handling communications planning, coaching, and training. I'm happy today to launch this episode of the PR Maven podcast featuring my conversation with Steve McCausland. Welcome to the PR Maven podcast, a podcast all about growing your network and building your brand through traditional and digital networking techniques. I'm Nancy Marshall, the PR Maven and CEO of Marshall Communications. I've been strengthening brands through PR for over 35 years, and now I'm celebrating the success of executives, influencers, business owners, and entrepreneurs from all around the world, all of whom have cultivated their brands and broadened their networks through traditional and digital networking methods. Each week, I interview one of these interesting and influential individuals and provide an opportunity for you, the PR Maven Nation, to gain insights from their strategies and stories. So stay tuned for this week's episode, and thanks for listening. Steve McCausland served 32 years as the spokesman for the Maine Department of Public Safety, handling information on over 500 homicides, another 500 fire deaths, and thousands of motor vehicle fatalities. Before retiring, he had a role in every major criminal investigation the department was involved in over those 3 decades. He served as an advisor to 8 commissioners of public safety and 8 chiefs of the state police on media relations and public and governmental policy. Steve started his media career as the news director of the radio station in Bath and worked part-time for the Portland Press-Herald, Associated Press, and WCSH-TV in Portland, Maine. He was elected and served 20 years on the Brunswick Town Council, serving 6 of those years as chairman. And now I am pleased to announce that Steve McCausland is joining the team at Marshall Communications as a communications strategist, working side by side but with my team to do crisis communications planning, coaching, and crisis communications management. Steve, tell me about your career with the Maine State Police and how you got into it in the first place.
I started in 1988, Nancy, as the public information officer and retired this past June after 32 years. This was a position I thought, even as a young reporter, that fit my mode. I had applied back in the 70s for this position, did not get it. I went on to another career, and when it came open again in 88, I thought I still had the interest, still might be able to contribute something to the cause, and I applied again, and Commissioner John Atwood at the time decided to hire me, and I never left.
Well, that's a good piece of advice right there, Steve, that if you don't get a job that you really want at the first try, you try again. So good for you for being persistent. So, Steve, we are going to be handling crisis communications together through our new partnership through Marshall Communications, and we'll be working with organizations that are in crisis. And how do you determine what is okay to say and what is not okay to say to the media in a crisis situation? Because I think that oftentimes people in crisis are perhaps even more afraid of the media than the actual crisis itself.
I think one of the worst things that an executive, a corporate executive, president of a nonprofit, a municipality has is when the satellite trucks from the television station start encircling the building, because there is obviously a story there, and they're following it up. And what you say and what you don't say can go a long way in getting your position out there in public, but more importantly, to tell the public what has taken place. Sometimes you can't say the whole story. Many times in crisis communication, you can't. But you have to be empathetic. I think you need to be able to respond promptly, and you never ever say no comment.
Yeah, I know that, because if you say no comment, immediately the media is going to start sniffing around for what you're trying to cover up. So you need to figure out something that's a level above no comment.
It just has a completely negative connotation. And there's a variety of things that you can say in the place of no comment. Example, that's not something we can get into at that time. It's under investigation. And when the proper time comes, we'll be more than willing to answer that question. But this is not the right time to address it. There's a lot of things you can do and say to put your best foot forward. Because in times of crisis, which is the reason you brought me into the fold here, these are very heady times. There's something serious that has taken place. The media knows about it. The media wants that side of the story. And many times people look like a deer caught in the headlights, or they say the darndest things that they shouldn't be, or they're giving up too much detail when they don't have all the facts. And so in the 32 years that I was at public safety, I dealt with crisis communication practically every week. And not always it was flattering to the agency. We've had some very heady times in which we had to explain why a certain person within our agency did something and try to explain it. So we relied on me to at least get the information out and to give advice to whoever was going to be in front of the camera. These are the things you can say, and these are the things to stay away from. And with your partnership with you, I hope to be able to share that knowledge with executives, nonprofits, government agencies, whoever may want to have an issue and want to use our expertise to help them get through it.
Well, we have worked together in the past. I know when I've been handling public relations for certain organizations, and I know that you were always very helpful to me. I know one time we were dealing with a bicycle accident, and I know that organizations are able to always defer to the Maine State Police or to local fire and safety officials. So I did learn that early on, that if there is an accident and you're working with fire and safety officials, you can always say, we are working closely with local officials and we will be updating you as we get more information. So like you said before, if you just at least assure the media that you will be keeping the lines of communication open as you learn more about what happened, I think that's a good piece of advice. But along those lines, what are some of the most basic universal rules of communicating with the media in a crisis?
Number one, you have to be timely. You can't put out a statement the day after something has boiled to the surface, that in order to get your side out in a situation, you've got to be upfront and in front of the cameras, putting out a news release, possibly a news conference to get your side out. You may not have all the facts, and you can explain that, but you can say, very similar to what you just said, that the matter is under investigation. We're fully cooperating with authorities. We're concerned about these allegations, and we'll do our best to get the answers that the public needs. But today is not the day to give out those details, other than to assure the public or the placeholders or the whoever, whatever we're addressing, whether it's the public, your stockholders, your members of your nonprofit organization, that we want to get the information out. We're going to cooperate, and more information will come out later. But today is not the day to do that, other than to assure people that we are going to get the answers, and when we do, we'll share them.
Yeah, and I would say, actually, first and foremost, if there have been victims of an accident of some kind, for example, last year you dealt with the very horrifying explosion in Farmington, and first and foremost, you want to express sympathy to the families of any victims and concern for anyone who's been injured. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it was just over a year ago that we went to Farmington, and my first task was to organize the early afternoon news conference to start getting the information out and getting the decision makers there. That included the governor, whose hometown this explosion took place in, the acting fire chief. Most of his fire department had been wiped out or in the hospital, the police chief, the sheriff, the town manager, and the state fire marshal, whose agency, which is part of public safety, and whose agency was going to be the chief investigator in this. At that time, we didn't have all the answers. At that first news conference, we didn't even announce all the names of the victims. We did later in the day when I put out a news release by email. But we assured the public that we're there. We don't know what happened, but we're going to find out, and we're going to tell the public when those conclusions have been reached.
Well, it has been my experience over the years that I've done this kind of work that being able to focus on what you're going to say actually sometimes has a calming effect on the people involved, because sometimes they are sometimes in shock and they just don't know what to think or how to feel. And I have found that when I'm working with clients in this kind of a situation, just creating what I call a message map, where you determine what your key messages are going to be, just gives them something to focus on. So I think that it's almost part of the healing process in a situation like this. But I think one of the most important things is to be prepared in advance of having a crisis. So that ties in with the media training and coaching that we are going to be doing, or crisis communications planning that you and I will be doing together. And how have you done this in the past? I know you've done quite a bit of media training with state government in the past.
I have had a number of occasions where I have taught media relations to a number of groups. There was a 25-year period where every police officer trained at the Criminal Justice Academy got a 2 or 3 hour block of police media relations. What to say, what to not say, and tips that I had imparted. And many times I brought in members of the media to help share that experience. Not all of them in the class paid attention. They had other things to be concerned about because they were about to graduate. But we assured them that if this might be the only media relations they had in their entire career, so it might be best that they pay at least a little bit of attention to what we had to say. But I've done similar courses with the Maine Municipal Association, fire departments around the state, and there's been a number of others that wanted me to come and at least talk to them about media relations. And there was a fire. I live in Camden now, and there was a fire around the corner here a couple of years ago. And I went out because primarily I was nosy, wanting to know what was going on. It was a neighbor's property. And one of the firemen remembered that I had spoken to a session somewhere down on Mount Desert Island years earlier. And I asked him whether he remembered anything. And he basically said, "You told us never to say no comment." And I always remembered that. And I thought if nothing else, that trip to Mount Desert Island for me was worth it, to at least have this firefighter come forward years later and remember that tidbit.
Well, I hope he remembered what he would say instead of no comment. But actually, obviously, it is different with every situation. And as I said earlier, I think to first express sympathy or empathy for the victims involved and to just show your humanity is very important. And, as I always tell people, when I'm writing blog posts or even in this podcast, all business is between human beings, and we all have hearts and we all have heads and brains, and we have to remember that we're humans. So, again, showing that you're very sorry that this happened in the first place is a good place to start.
One thing to remember is that public relations is good public policy because it's the public you're talking to. Now, whether you're in government where the stakes are much higher because the public is very much involved. They pay your salaries. They are involved in government. Or you're in a business where you're dealing with the public. These are possibly customers that are affected. Or it's a nonprofit and you're dealing with funding groups which come from the public. So many companies, I think, don't really think in advance of what we might be able to do in a crisis situation. Either that or it's never going to happen to them. And so the training that we're going to offer, Nancy, will enable them to at least get some of the basics that they can utilize that hopefully they may never have to talk about, but at least they'll have a basis to talk to. And that's the reason you asked me 5 years ago to consider coming on board once I retired from state government. Frankly, and this isn't brag, this is fact, you probably don't even need me. You are one of the wise women of public relations in this state. You have a wealth of experience in this industry and in life in general. But I was flattered when you asked me to join you in this venture, and we'll see what happens.
Well, thank you for the compliment, Steve. And I do remember seeing you. It was at the Senator in Augusta, actually. It was a meeting of the Maine Public Relations Council. And I have always admired you, Steve. And I remember saying, hey, Steve, when you retire, you should come work with me. And I think you seemed a little bit flabbergasted, but you remembered. And I was so glad you remembered. And then you called me I think it was towards the end of 2019, and said, I'm going to be retiring, and I'd like to keep my hand in the business. So I feel that we'll have a lot to offer, and other members of my team as well, as far as applying the kind of planning that we've always done with our Marshall Plan process, which is essentially collaborating with the leadership team from an organization. And if we do this planning process, we would probably spend even a half a day together sort of imagining what are the crises that could potentially happen, and then make sure that we have everything in order as far as having a binder and online files where we would have everyone's contact information and media lists ready, and all the procedures and protocols in place to create a command center, which is what you really should do during a crisis. You'd have a place where the leadership team of an organization can gather together and designate the spokesperson or spokespeople. And another thing is really to have procedures in place to notify all of the employees. I know when I worked at Sugarloaf for many years, we had to keep in mind that there were people at the ticket counter and the guest services desk and on the telephone who needed to be updated, maybe even before the media, because you want to be sure that all of your internal audiences are aware of what's going on. Because sometimes the media will call. And also the employees need to know that they are not the spokespeople for the media. And that's why it's important to designate one person. And so you and I would be doing media training with that person, hopefully before the crisis happens, so that person feels comfortable, as you say, when the satellite trucks are there and the TV cameras and the actual media people are doing interviews. So, Steve, we're going to continue our conversation in just a moment. But first, I want to tell the listeners of PR Maven Nation about my new book, which is Grow Your Audience, Grow Your Brand, available now on Amazon.com as a paperback or Kindle edition. And soon it's going to be available on Audible. And it's a book that includes actionable advice on growing your network and growing your brand by taking care of your audience. And we'll be giving away a free Kindle edition of the book if you go to prmaven.com/giveaway. And after a moment, we're going to hear more from Steve McCausland, who's now communications specialist at Marshall Communications.
Do you want to grow your client or customer base? Perhaps increase brand awareness? Maybe tell your unique story more effectively? Of course you do. But you may be worried that you don't have enough expertise to make that happen. Well, no worries, PR Maven Nation. Let the PR Maven herself, Nancy Marshall, show you how easy it is to get your message across effectively using a powerful yet simple tool, a message map. Nancy's training is often called informative and constructive, well-designed and impactful, with a perfect blend of theory and real-life experience. You will leverage Nancy's expertise to create your own message map when you register for this comprehensive online video training course, which is broken down into 4 easy-to-understand modules. Normally, this course is priced at $147, but for listeners of the PR Maven podcast, that's you, PR Maven Nation, it's only $29 when you enter the code word podcast during enrollment. It even includes a workbook and bonus content to guide you through the process. So go to prmaven.com and click on the Message Map Mastery course to enroll today. Remember, enter the word podcast during enrollment for a special discounted price of $29.
Welcome back. And today we're talking with Steve McCausland, who is now communications specialist at Marshall Communications. And I want to dive back in with more questions for Steve. Steve, what is the best way for a company or organization to prepare for a crisis, and why is it important to be prepared?
Preparing for a crisis is very similar to preparing for any other emergency. Many companies do fire drills. They might have active shooting drills. Unfortunately, that's in recent years, companies, businesses, schools have had to prepare for that. And hand in hand with all this preparation for an emergency is preparing for a crisis, in which could take place in a variety of ways. It could be multiple deaths. It could be a scandal of some kind. It could be an accusation. And to be completely ill-prepared is probably setting a company, business, entity for trouble. And to having some basic things in the toolbox ready to know what to say, what not to say, and to help facilitate those first hours. We were all told as we grew up, you can't redo a first impression. And when a crisis takes place, and the company, the entity is the focal point of whatever issue this is, there's no redo on a first impression. And so Nancy and I will have the tools to impart to these companies, these entities, some of the things to do to at least make sure that their side gets out in some fashion. It may not be the complete story, and most likely won't be, but it shows at least an initial response, which has empathy, has some information, and has the assurance that things are going to be better.
Right, because a lot of the way you respond to a crisis will impact the reputation of your organization for the long term, as well as the leaders of the organization. So it's important for what we call reputation management to be well prepared and to handle a crisis in a professional manner. So, Steve, if you were to arrive on the scene of a crisis situation, say, for example, an active shooter at a business or a school, which it's horrible to think about, but these things do happen, what is the first thing that you would do?
Well, you sit down and get an assessment of what's going on. And if I can sort of use the Farmington explosion as an example, and the fire department, which had been literally wiped out. One firefighter was killed there. Several were seriously injured. And Farmington at that time had three chiefs or assistant chiefs. And the one that was still there, he and I had a conversation very early. One of the people in the hospital, in addition to every firefighter he knew very well, one of the people injured was his own son, who was a full-time member of the department. And we talked about, I sat down with him and talked about the importance of him being involved in the initial briefings, because the people of Maine wanted to know what these firefighters had gone through. And the only person that could do that, could tell their story, that knew their history, was the last man standing that day, and that was the assistant fire chief, Tim Hardy. And we spoke, and I also told him that I wanted to make sure that I had the names of the injured, their correct spelling, how long they had been with the department, and their correct rank. Because many times, sometimes spelling of names in the early hours isn't the best. Dealing with police, as I did for 3 decades, they're the worst spellers in the world, and sometimes they get the spelling of the names wrong. And when we put out that the names later that afternoon, I wanted to make absolutely certain they were correct. And he and I spoke. He was on mark. He was in the game, and at the news conference that we all attended, he hit a home run because he told the firefighter's story from the firefighter aspect. And he was the only one in Farmington that was able to do it. And he did a remarkable job. And I'm pleased that I was able to at least help him get his message out.
And this is something you and I have spoken about, because in many situations, it would be easier for the company involved to have you be the spokesman. But what we've talked about is it's much more authentic and credible to have someone from within, as you did with the Farmington Fire Department, to have somebody in the department be the spokesperson. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and I will use another example of the flip side. Years earlier, and this also was a firefighter, he was the sheriff of Waldo County. He was also the local fire chief, and there was a horrific fire in the community that he lived in, and he died of a heart attack on the scene. And that fire department and the sheriff's department at the time, the deputy chief had a horrible cold. And they called and asked me to come to Belfast to handle all the media. And it was that day that I handled the media for them, because there was frankly no one else to do it. But those were rare occasions where if the deputy chief of the sheriff's department, who now was acting chief, was able to talk and wasn't suffering a horrific cold, it would have been far better for him to do it. But he was in sad shape health-wise, unrelated to the tragedy that they were dealing with. And so they asked and called me, and I drove to Belfast, got the initial information, and got the information out at the news conference. So sometimes I was the face and the voice, but it is far more preferable to have someone who is part of the organization, the CEO, the organization's president, the fire chief. They're the ones that can tell the story. It is their organization they're speaking for, and they know that organization far better than a hired gun.
So I imagine that sometimes when you're media training someone who's really never been in front of a TV camera, for example, you're telling them things about like where to look and how to hold themselves so they look credible. And, So what are some of those tips that you give people if they're standing in front of the TV camera for the first time?
I haven't actually taught this aspect for a while, but that was an aspect that I taught every police chief, every police officer that came to the Criminal Justice Academy. Some basic things. Number one, look at yourself in the mirror first. Make sure you don't have some lunch still stuck in your teeth. Those spitballs on the side of your mouth. That's what the TV folks do before they do a stand-up, and you should do the same thing. Get rid of the sunglasses. In my case, when I was doing on-scene info, I'm very susceptible to sunlight. I squint, and I look very cross. And so I always insisted that I was not facing direct into the sunlight. Cameramen love to put you right in the sunlight because they don't have to dub around with any lighting issues. But they can move their cameras. They can adjust their cameras to set the scene. And the spokesman in this case, which was me, would be far more comfortable talking about it rather than squinting in front of the camera. A couple of other things. Always make sure, you've checked out your, if you're in police officer's case, make sure their uniform is correct, that their tie is straight, that your hair is not a mess. First, you don't get a second chance for a first impression. And many times when people saw me on television, they say, I saw you on TV, Steve, about whatever the issue was. And I said, well, what did you think I did? Well, I didn't listen to you, Steve. I just watched you. I mean, it was all visual. And so those are important things to know. And most people don't. Many times back to the placement of where you are, this was a tragedy along the side of the road. The cameras were all set up. And many times police officers feel obligated, well, this is where I have to stand because this is where the cameras are. Well, the cameras may not be in a safe location. It may be too noisy with all the traffic going by. And so many times I will say, okay, let's go under this. Let's go off here to under this apple tree and preset up. I'll be over there in 10 minutes and answer the questions that I can. They do that. They break their cameras down, go over. But the secret is it gives you an extra 10 minutes to prepare for what you're going to say. And so when you go there, you know what you're going to say. You have some key points that you've sort of either have written down or you've sort of practiced, or a few lines that you want to make sure you impart. And things come out much better because you've given a decent first impression.
That's a very good piece of advice. And I think that members of the media will appreciate it if you suggest a better position for their camera. I think too many people defer, responsibility to the media and don't realize that, again, journalists are just human beings. And many of them are young people who haven't had a lot of life experience. And in any given day, a lot of media people have to be covering all kinds of different industries. So they may not be experts in any specific industry. So they appreciate having someone give them advice and, taking a few extra minutes to move a camera around, or even taking a few extra minutes to talk about what they plan to ask you before you start the interview is okay. So I think that if you treat media people, first of all, as if you're not adversarial towards them, and that together you're trying to tell a story that is fair and accurate, and that you trust them, but that you may not be giving them all the details. As you said, you might not even have the details. So I think my experience in working with journalists is that if you treat them fairly and with respect, they will give you that same respect back. So I know that they can be very scary to many people, especially in crisis, but taking those few extra minutes to get things set up is important.
And a point you mentioned too, Nancy, is that much of the media now are very young, particularly compared to you or I. But the point is that they've come to Maine many times on their first job out of college, and they will be leaving Maine the first chance they get to go to a bigger market, if it's television or even newspaper. So they may need a roadmap to get to Augusta or whatever scene you're dealing with. They're that new. And so, and I sometimes had to remind myself that I was also in that same boat. I knew how to get to Augusta because, frankly, I was born in Augusta. And the reason I was born in Augusta, I wanted to be close to my mother that night. But I grew up in Brunswick, and we were all young once, and we sometimes didn't know what to ask. This was for reporters, this may have been the first time they've ever dealt with this particular subject. And so you can help them set the stage and explain what's going on by just having some institutional information. This is the issue. This is the industry you're dealing with. We're involved in these aspects, and just some general background information that sometimes can be helpful, particularly for a new reporter, because they've never dealt with this particular issue.
That's a very good point, to actually suggest some questions that they may ask you. And that leads to my next question is, it's often difficult in a crisis because there's a lot of emotions and turmoil going on. So how can you attempt to keep to your own agenda and get your own messages out in a situation like this?
You prepare for it. And you prepare for it because you've either had some training from Marshall Communications, you know the subject area because you're an industry expert. The reason why you put your best person in front of the cameras because they are the most knowledgeable regarding the particular incident issue that is the reason why there is a crisis here. We've talked about it before. You may not be able to get, and most likely will not be able to get into specific details, but you can talk about the business, the industry, the assurance that they're cooperating or getting the answers needed to find out exactly why this incident happened, and that all the answers are not going to be taking place on day one. But the public needs to have assurances that things will be better, things will be in control, and that spokesperson, whether it is the executive of this organization, whether it is a person designated as the spokesperson, they will hopefully have the tools available to navigate these waters, which they may have never traveled before.
I think you make a very good point that you just need to assure people that things will be better, and that you're going to be taking care of the situation, and that you will be keeping them updated as you learn more about it. So, a lot of it is having a spokesman or spokesperson who is calm, cool, and collected, which is actually one of the reasons why you are so good at what you do, because you stay calm and cool under pressure, I think.
Thanks. It was all a facade, but I did many times be able to pull it off because I knew what I could say, and I also knew what I couldn't say. And I dealt in my career with handling the information for more than 500 homicides that occurred in Maine. And the Attorney General's office, which prosecutes all of them, had some very strict guidelines that I knew about on day one. Things you can say, things you can't say. And you can say everything in a variety of ways, but you have that basic do's and don'ts that you could fall back on, that at least got the information out initially. And most times, obviously, the final story would come out much later on with an arrest, with an indictment, and with a court hearing. But at least initially, you were able to get some of the information out on one of the most important stories that anybody would have to deal with, and that would be a homicide. And unfortunately, in my career of 30 years, I dealt with more than 500 of them.
That's got to be a really hard thing to deal with. 500 homicides. That's 500 human lives, which is a very sad thing to think about. But I'm sure that the public was well served when you were able to try to explain at least a little bit of what was going on. So, Steve, is there a book, an app, or a website that you have found helpful in your career, and why?
Well, it's your books, obviously. I found them greatly helpful, Nancy. You told me to say that at the beginning, so I'm repeating that. I hope I'm doing it right. But in all seriousness, there's a number of professional organizations that you and I have belonged to over the years. The Maine Public Relations Council is one, which has been very active. On the police side, there was a national organization, which I went to several of their national conferences, in which speakers came in on a wide variety of issues that we all remember. Catastrophes, homicides, the Waco incident, the Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest that took place. And we had the principals come in and tell us everything. And I mean everything. But it was helpful to learn from that so that we could all go back to our home communities and hopefully not deal with those specific horrific events, but at least have some of the knowledge that we had gained from these national conferences to impart on whatever issue we were dealing with locally.
I think that kind of information sharing and networking is one of the important parts of being involved with a national organization. And I just hope that we get through this COVID situations, that we can all get back to professional networking. I know I miss it terribly because, well, I'm a very social person, as you know. But I do think that a lot of organizations are doing webinars and Zoom sessions now, so we can get that kind of professional development online. I know the Maine Public Relations Council has been doing that, and I appreciate it very much.
And we can do Zoom meetings too, but there's no comparison for an actual face-to-face meeting that everyone is as familiar with. There's the networking aspect. No matter what industry you're in, it's just so important to get back to normal, and we will get back there someday. But this has gone on a long time. It's not over yet, but things are going to get back to normal eventually, and we can continue where we left off.
Well, you are very reassuring, and I do believe you because you are very believable, Steve. And I think that's one of the things about you, the attributes that make you a great spokesperson. So I want to thank you for being with me today. And if people want to follow up with Steve, I'm going to announce now he does have a Marshall PR email address, which is S. McCausland. It's SMCCAUSLAND @marshallpr.com. If you want to email Steve, and he actually is going to have a telephone extension at Marshall PR, which is 207-623-4177. And basically, Steve and I will be taking calls from clients who are in crisis or who want to do crisis communications planning. And Steve, I really look forward to working with you. And I think we do have a lot of experience, especially you, that we can share with organizations throughout Maine and actually nationally. So thank you for being my guest today. And I hope everyone in PR Maven Nation enjoyed the conversation and has a great day today. That's it for this week's episode. I'd like to thank you for listening. And if you feel that you've gotten value out of today's conversation, consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes or whatever app you're using to tune in. If you haven't subscribed yet, you should do so. I release a new episode each week, and subscribing will make sure you get an alert when there's a new episode. You can also join the PR Maven Nation by going to prmaven.com/nation and clicking join. It's free, and it's a great community of like-minded individuals who are all looking to learn and grow from one another. If you have an Alexa-enabled device, be sure to add the PR Maven Marketing Minute to your daily flash briefing menu. Thanks again for listening, and have a great rest of your week, PR Maven Nation.